Air shows are meant to amaze, but sometimes they turn into scenes of absolute horror. From supersonic jets spiraling into fireballs to tragic crashes right in front of stunned families, these spectacles have claimed lives in the most shocking ways imaginable. In this video, we'll count down 5 of the most horrific airshow deaths ever. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. On September 16, 2011, what started as a thrilling day of high-speed aviation turned into one of the darkest moments in airshow history. The setting was Reno Airport in Nevada, home of the famous Reno air races. These races are often described as the world's fastest motorsport, where pilots push themselves and their machines to the absolute limit. Each year, crowds gathered to witness highly skilled aviators maneuver warbirds and racing aircraft at breathtaking speeds, sometimes just a few meters above the ground. Imagine cars speeding at 200 miles per hour in NASCAR, except in the sky, with machines capable of flying faster than 800 kilometers per hour. That's the intensity of Reno. On that fateful day, one particular plane drew the crowd's attention, a North American P-51 Mustang, a legendary World War II fighter jet nicknamed the Galloping Ghost. This wasn't just a museum piece, it had been heavily modified to race at maximum speed. Under its controls was 74-year-old Jimmy Leeward, a seasoned Hollywood stunt pilot and air racer with more than 13,000 hours of flying experience. He wasn't just familiar with planes, he lived and breathed them. Over the years, he'd earned permits for multiple aircraft types, including experimental models. To the thousands of fans watching, Leeward represented the heart of Reno: courage, speed, and skill. That afternoon, Leeward was among the top 3 pilots competing. The crowd was buzzing with excitement as the aircraft thundered past the stands in tight formation. But then, in an instant, everything changed. After executing a high-speed turn near the spectator area, Leeward's Mustang suddenly pitched upward at an almost vertical angle. For a brief moment, the plane disappeared against the clouds, and onlookers thought it might be part of the maneuver. But seconds later, horror unfolded. The Galloping Ghost rolled inverted and then dropped into a violent nosedive. Traveling at nearly 640 kilometers per hour, it plummeted directly toward the packed grandstands. The crowd barely had time to register what was happening. There was no chance to react or run. In a heartbeat, the P-51 slammed into the spectator area with catastrophic force. The impact was devastating. The sheer speed of the crash meant that everything within several dozen meters was obliterated instantly. Debris, parts of the plane, and tragically people. Survivors recalled the deafening sound, followed by clouds of dust and the sickening silence that comes after disaster, only to be broken by panicked screams and cries for help. People rushed in every direction, desperately trying to escape the chaos, while others, just meters away, were still frozen in shock, some even capturing the horror on their phones. One small mercy was that the Mustang's fuel dispersed into the air before it could ignite. Had there been an explosion, the death toll might have been far higher. Even without fire, the tragedy was immense. 7 people, including Jimmy Leeward, died instantly at the crash site. 4 more later succumbed to their injuries in hospitals, bringing the death toll to 11. Dozens more were left with serious, life-altering injuries. But what caused such a catastrophic failure in the first place? Investigations revealed chilling details. The Galloping Ghost had undergone extensive modifications over the years to squeeze out every ounce of speed possible. These changes included structural adjustments that weakened the airframe. Even worse, some of the fasteners and components inside the plane hadn't been replaced for over 25 years. During the race, as Leeward pushed the Mustang to its limits, the stresses on the aircraft became unbearable. In the middle of that high G turn near the stands, critical components failed. The aircraft began to deform, and ultimately control was lost. The Reno air races had seen crashes before. It's a dangerous sport by nature, but nothing on this scale. The 2011 disaster remains the deadliest tragedy in the event's history, and one of the darkest days in airshow culture worldwide. What was supposed to be a celebration of speed and aviation turned into a reminder of just how unforgiving the sky can be. On July 3, 1973, the aviation world witnessed a dark and unforgettable tragedy. The stage was the Paris Airshow in Le Bourget, France, one of the most prestigious aviation events on Earth, where nations unveiled their newest technological marvels. But this time, instead of a proud showcase, the event descended into horror before a stunned international audience. That year, competition in the skies was fierce. On one side was the Anglo-French Concorde, already dazzling crowds as the first commercial supersonic passenger jet. On the other stood the Soviet Union's response, the Tupolev Tu-144, quickly nicknamed Konkordsky because of its striking resemblance to its Western rival. The Cold War wasn't just about missiles and space. It extended into passenger aviation, and Le Bourget became the ultimate arena for this rivalry. The Tu-144 was still in its experimental phase, but this flight was meant to prove Soviet engineering could match the West. A crew of 6 carried not only the aircraft, but the weight of national pride, as thousands of spectators, including rival engineers and journalists, watched closely. The jet took off and roared across the skies at less than 600 meters. To those on the ground, it was breathtaking, a massive airliner performing with the speed and sharpness of a fighter. Then, without warning, the plane pitched over violently and plunged into a steep dive. The engines thundered as if fighting to recover, but it was too late. Before tens of thousands of horrified spectators, the Tu-144 began to break apart in midair. Fragments of the aircraft scattered before slamming into a nearby residential area. Within seconds, 15 houses were damaged or destroyed. When the dust cleared, all 6 crew members were dead, along with 8 civilians on the ground. In total, 14 lives were lost, and countless others traumatized by the violent spectacle. Investigators quickly launched an inquiry, but answers were elusive. One widely circulated theory suggested the Soviet pilot had been forced into a sudden evasive maneuver to avoid a French Mirage fighter jet. That Mirage had reportedly been scrambled to secretly photograph the Tu-144 during its flight. French officials later admitted the reconnaissance jet had been airborne, but denied it ever crossed the Tupolev's path. The wreckage offered little clarity. The main flight recorder, which could have explained the jet's final moments, had not been switched on before takeoff. Other recorders were destroyed in the crash. With so little evidence, the exact cause was never determined. Moscow moved swiftly to contain the fallout, covering all damages and compensation while keeping the full investigation report classified. For the Soviets, the tragedy was a crushing blow. The Tu-144 program was already plagued by design flaws and technical challenges. The Le Bourget disaster destroyed its credibility, and within years, the aircraft was phased out of development. Even Concorde, its Western rival, would see its ambitions limited to a handful of luxury routes before eventually being retired. Today, the Tu-144 crash at Le Bourget remains one of the most haunting moments in airshow history. What should have been a triumphant display of technological progress became a fiery catastrophe, one that left behind far more questions than answers. On September 6, 1952, what was supposed to be a proud celebration of British aviation turned into one of the most horrifying tragedies in airshow history. The event was the first major post-war air race, held in the English town of Farnborough. The excitement was electric. Around 120,000 spectators had gathered to watch cutting-edge aircraft show off their capabilities. At the center of the show was a sleek new British jet prototype, piloted by none other than John Derry, a national hero and aviation legend. Derry wasn't just any pilot. He was the first Briton to break the sound barrier in a jet, a symbol of post-war progress and national pride. To the massive crowd, seeing him perform was the highlight of the day, and Derry, ever the showman, wanted to give them a display they would never forget. Flying at astonishing speeds, he decided to create a spectacle by directing the shockwave of his jet right toward the spectator stands. First, he climbed to an altitude of over 12,000 meters, appearing as nothing more than a silver speck in the sky. Then, he pointed the nose of the aircraft downward and roared earthward at nearly 800 kilometers per hour. The crowd squinted upward, watching that tiny dot grow larger and larger until it transformed into a roaring fighter jet streaking just overhead, no higher than 15 meters above their heads. The effect was breathtaking. The roar of the engines and the concussive blast of air reached them only after the jet had already vanished behind the stands. People gasped and cheered, their hearts pounding at the sheer thrill of it. But as Derry banked left to make another daring pass over the crowd, something went terribly, irreversibly wrong. At roughly 830 kilometers per hour, the aircraft suddenly began to fail under the strain. In less than a second, the jet's structure disintegrated. The outer wing sections, both engines and even the cockpit itself tore free from the airframe, scattering across the sky like shrapnel. With both crew members still trapped inside, the cockpit plummeted straight down, slamming into the ground directly in front of horrified spectators. The red-hot engines, still blazing from the stress of flight, hurtled like missiles into an area known as Observation Hill, a popular spot packed with hundreds of onlookers. For a brief moment, there was only stunned silence. The crowd, frozen in disbelief, could hardly process what had just happened. Then came the screams. Chaos erupted as people realized that not only had the pilots been killed, but debris and fiery wreckage had also torn through the stands. Witnesses later recalled seeing the lifeless bodies of the two crewmen flung onto a spectator fence. At the site of the engine impacts, a crater smoldered, surrounded by twisted wreckage and the remains of innocent victims. Among those killed was a young couple who had died holding each other, an image that would forever haunt those who saw it. The toll was staggering. 31 people lost their lives that day, including several children who had come with their families for what was meant to be their first air show. Another 63 were injured, many suffering gruesome skull fractures and broken bones that rescuers compared to battlefield wounds. Red Cross workers and emergency responders rushed to the scene, but even they were overwhelmed by the scale of the carnage. Investigators later determined the cause, a catastrophic design flaw in the aircraft's wings. Instead of meeting the required strength, the wings had only about 64% of the structural integrity needed to survive the violent maneuver Derry had attempted. In other words, the jet was doomed the moment he pushed it beyond its limits. The Farnborough disaster sent shockwaves through the aviation world. It forced organizers to impose stricter safety rules and redesign airshow protocols to protect spectators. Yet, as history would prove, even these changes could not prevent future tragedies on an even greater scale. On August 28, 1988, one of the most shocking tragedies in airshow history unfolded before a crowd of nearly 300,000 spectators at Rammstein Air Base in West Germany. The event, known as Flugtag, was a showcase of military aviation, drawing families, aviation fans, and curious locals eager to see high-speed aerobatics from some of the world's most elite pilots. That afternoon, the Italian Air Force's famed display team, the Frecce Tricolori, prepared for their signature maneuver, the Pierced Heart. It was a breathtaking stunt involving 10 jets. 2 groups of planes would split away, 5 flying left and 4 flying right, sketching the shape of a giant heart across the sky. The final jet, call sign Pony 10, would then streak through the middle like an arrow piercing it. The formation was designed to wow audiences with perfect timing, speed, and grace. But on this day, the maneuver went fatally wrong. As the heart formation neared completion, Lieutenant Colonel Ivo Naldini, flying Pony 10, approached the crossing point at tremendous speed. In a split second, disaster struck. Pony 10 collided with Pony 1, tearing the tail off the lead aircraft. The crippled plane spun out of control, slamming into Pony 2. Within moments, all 3 jets were falling from the sky. Lieutenant Mario Naldini, piloting Pony 1, managed to eject, but his parachute had no time to fully deploy. He was killed instantly. The pilot of Pony 2, Giorgio Alessio, perished when his jet exploded midair. A medical helicopter nearby was also struck, killing its pilot. But the most horrifying part was still ahead. The flaming wreckage of Pony 10, now completely out of control, plummeted directly toward the packed spectator stands. In less than 7 seconds from the first collision, the jet slammed into the ground and exploded in a massive fireball. tons of burning debris and molten metal rained down onto the crowd, right where thousands of families had gathered. What followed was sheer chaos. At first, stunned silence gripped the audience. Then, screams and panic erupted. Survivors described seeing people running with their clothes on fire, desperately trying to escape the flames. Others were trapped under wreckage or entangled in red-hot barbed wire, flung from nearby fences. Parents clutched their children, some badly burned, as rescuers rushed in. The scale of the disaster overwhelmed emergency crews, vehicles of every kind, military, civilian, even private cars, were used to transport the injured to hospitals. Traffic jams stretched for hours as panicked spectators tried to flee the base while ambulances fought to get in. By the end, the toll was staggering. 70 people killed and 346 injured, many with life-altering burns and fractures. For years, the Rammstein disaster stood as the deadliest airshow accident in history. As for the cause, investigations pointed to one crucial factor. Lieutenant Colonel Naldini had likely entered the maneuver too fast and too low, leaving no room for error. Some witnesses claimed they saw Pony 10's landing gear drop just before impact, suggesting he may have tried to slow down in a desperate last-second attempt to avoid the collision. Others speculated about a sudden technical failure, but no definitive proof was ever found. The tragedy at Rammstein remains etched in aviation history, not only as a technical failure but as a haunting reminder of how quickly a dazzling display can turn into a nightmare. July 27, 2002, was meant to be a proud celebration for Ukraine. At Sknyliv airfield near Lviv, a massive airshow was organized to mark the 60th anniversary of a Ukrainian Air Corps division. The excitement was enormous. Around 10,000 people gathered, many bringing their families. Parents took time off work. Children clutched balloons and snacks, and crowds buzzed with anticipation of spectacular aerial maneuvers. Originally, a MiG-29 fighter jet had been scheduled to perform, but when bad weather prevented its arrival, a Sukhoi Su-27, one of the most advanced jets in Ukraine's arsenal, was brought in instead. For the seasoned pilots of the Ukrainian Falcons aerobatic team, this substitution seemed routine. Few could have imagined that within minutes, the day would turn into the deadliest airshow disaster in history. At 12:52 p.m., the Su-27 began a low rolling maneuver directly over the tightly packed crowd, but something was clearly wrong. The jet dipped dangerously low, flipped its wing on the ground, and struck two parked aircraft before careening into the spectators. The wing sliced through the audience like a blade, sending bodies and debris flying. Seconds later, the fighter erupted into a massive fireball, engulfing the area in flames and black smoke. The carnage was almost beyond comprehension. Survivors recalled scenes of absolute chaos, people screaming, running with their clothes on fire, desperately trying to escape. For those closest to the crash, there was no chance. Among the survivors was a 3-year-old boy named Oleg, known in reports as Oop. He lived only because his mother threw herself over him, shielding him from the blast. Tragically, she was killed, along with dozens of others, including Oleg's 10-year-old brother, who was thrown by the shockwave but miraculously survived. Stories like this multiplied, parents sacrificing themselves for their children, families torn apart in an instant. The statistics were staggering. 77 people killed, 28 of them children, more than 250 others injured. The destruction was so complete that rescuers described the aftermath with one chilling word: biomass. Many victims were impossible to identify. Ukraine declared a national day of mourning, but grief quickly gave way to anger. As investigations unfolded, attention turned to accountability. Both pilots had ejected and survived. Criminal charges were filed against 10 people connected to the show's organization. In the end, primary pilot Volodymyr Toponar was sentenced to 14 years in prison, while his co-pilot, Yuri Yegorov, received 8 years. Several officers were also punished, though higher-ranking generals and commanders of the Air Force were acquitted. Toponar, a veteran with 27 years of flying experience, insisted that his engines lost power during the maneuver, something he could not control. But prosecutors argued the pilots had been pressured into dangerous stunts directly above the crowd without adequate preparation or training. Regardless of the technical cause, the court's ruling stood firm. The disaster at Sknyliv remains the deadliest airshow tragedy in history. In its aftermath, Ukraine banned all military airshows, and the event became a permanent scar in aviation history. What was supposed to be a celebration of national pride ended as a sobering reminder of the catastrophic risks when spectacle overtakes safety.